Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for taking the time to join on this early Tuesday morning, or at least it's kind of early for me here in Central Time Zone. Paula, very nice of you to join. How are you this morning?
Doing great, can't complain.
Awesome. You got a little extra time since you're in Eastern Time Zone, but I wanted to try to get this before people's workday began so they'd have an opportunity to learn about CMMC first thing in the morning. Woohoo! We'll
Great way to
give
start the
just
day.
That is a great way to start the day. I totally agree. But I'm a nerd and I have a feeling I'm joined by another fellow nerd today. So thank you. Well, awesome. We'll give just actually it's 9:01 here in Texas, so we'll just go ahead and get started. Thank you all so much for joining. Thank you, Paula, for joining this morning as well. We're going to have an awesome dialogue about CMMC compliance and really cutting through the confusion. So very quickly, we do want to take your questions. We're so glad that you're here. Thank you for taking your time. I know that time is probably the most valuable thing. So thank you very much. We definitely want your questions. There's Q&A in the session here. So definitely put your questions. If we pick them up as we go, we'll certainly do that. Thank you. You all know the agenda. You signed up for this. And so let's just jump right into the meat of this. So let's talk about some common misconceptions. We obviously at Hotman Group are doing a whole lot more CMMC work now that it's official and companies really just can't totally ignore it anymore. But we're definitely seeing some misconceptions. So this first one is, oh, yay, just another compliance framework, just another check the box to get this thing done. Paula, what are your thoughts on that? Is this another checkbox exercise?
Uh, no, it's not. Well, uh, it's you have to. It's a checkbox in the sense that you have to have it in order to do business with the Department of Defense, probably
Yeah,
going forward.
good point.
But at the same time, these are a baseline of security standards your company should have anyway in
Yeah.
order to keep its networks, its data, even its own company data safe, not just CUI.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. I say that about all compliance. There's this whole thing, security is not compliance. And yes, they are different, definitely two separate disciplines, but compliance's intent is to be secure. When companies start checking boxes in compliance and start shortcutting, that's where you lose the benefit of security. So just exactly
Right.
what you said, Paula, this is baseline technical security practices that companies should really take a hard look at. Yes, sure, great, get CMMC in the end, if that's your company's pursuits, but really take that kind of lens. Here's another one. It's only for large contractors. I don't, I'm not an L3 or a Boeing. I don't need to worry about this, right? Isn't that the
Yeah,
case?
even the guy who makes the screws for the airplanes has to be CMMC compliant at this point,
Granted.
if
Yep.
it's handed down in their contract. Um, so it's really for everybody. I think there's 80,000 companies in the defense industrial base, and most of those are not large. Most of those are small businesses.
Yeah, that's a very interesting, but it's a really rigorous framework with a lot of nitpicky details that we'll get into as we continue through this. And so you brought up even the company that makes the screw, like they have to think about this too. So to some degree, it feels like a lot and it's daunting, because it's the same requirements kind of across the board. And that is an interesting dynamic of this. But I like what you said a little bit earlier, Paula. This is good security practice. These are good technical
Mhm.
controls that need to be in place. So really every company should look at this. This is one of my personal favorites. Oh, wait a minute. Oh, no, 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 no. I don't need to worry about the CMMC thing because I just buy this thing over here and push the button and I am totally compliant. We struggle with this, quite frankly, in helping companies with a lot of the frameworks. And I'm seeing the same
Yeah.
thing popping out about CMMC. Oh, buy my tool, buy my service, whatever, and then push the button and woo, voila, you're compliant. What are your thoughts on that, Paula? Is that even possible with CMMC?
It's not because there's controls that aren't technical that are in
Yeah,
there, like your physical security, they can't help you with that. Your HR
yeah.
policies, they can't help you with that. They can't help you with risk management. They can't help you with your change management. And those are all things that are part of CMMC. So there is no magic button. There's hard work to get compliant. any which way around.
Yeah, I agree. It's kind of like life, people want to be healthy, lose weight. Well, I'm sorry. It's work. There's all sorts of stuff out there that says take this, do this, and magically it'll just happen. But the reality is yeah, this stuff is definitely just work. Now,
It's
not
worthwhile
to
work,
it
but
very
work.
worthwhile work. Now, this is not to say tools can't be helpful, and we'll talk about that
Oh
a little bit
yeah,
later for
right.
sure. But yeah, just this whole conception, I just buy this thing or use this service, and I don't really need to worry about this thing. So here's another one. This is a big deal. So I already do SOC 2, ISO, fill in the blank, whatever framework, regulatory hair. I don't really need to worry about CMMC. CMMC is very prescriptive, kind of like PCI, kind of like high trust, quite frankly. And so while there's tremendous overlap, they are very much two different things. Paul, you have anything to add to that?
Well, CMMC really comes from your government contracts. So the requirement to have CMMC is going to be written into whatever paper you sign from the government. So, you got to make sure that you're covering what they say. But I will say that we're seeing more ISO being included in those government
Yeah,
contracts as well.
definitely.
So not a bad idea to have that too.
Yeah, no, totally agree. And definitely, we'll talk about this later, but you don't want to run these in silos either. You definitely want to bring these together. ISO obviously can be more kind of right size. CMMC, as you already brought up, if you're level two, you're level two. It doesn't really matter if you're a big guy or a little guy. You still have to kind of work through all those 320 requirements. And then our last misconception here that we're going to cover at the beginning before we continue on through this is that it's a one-time certification. Again, CMMC is another security framework. It's one obviously that's very prescriptive, has a very specific use case in dealing with the government. And so, it's different in that regard. But the reality is there's lots of other security frameworks out there, and it's not entirely dissimilar. So I hear this all the time for companies, even in the other frameworks, like, oh, whoo, I got it. I got my certification. Okay, well, that actually just started your journey. It's not really a one-time thing. So, Paul, you want to
Right.
high level talk about how CMMC specifically, this is not a one-time thing.
No, it's not at all. It's you get your certification, it's ongoing compliance. So all the
Yep.
things that you've worked so hard to be compliant with, you have to keep those up over time. So after your 3 PAO, which is your third party assessment, comes in and says you're good, every year you have to self attest and do a self assessment
Yep.
and report that back to the government. And then on the third year, you have to do a third party assessment again.
Yep. Very
So
similar to
if you want to
ISO.
keep your right, you want to keep your certification, you've got to keep all these standards up.
Yeah. And the intent of the standards is never to just get it done, check the box, and then not think about it for a year. Or wait, Paula, is that what they meant? Is you just get it done and then you don't think about this stuff for a year and then you just kind of knock the
No,
dust off,
no,
resurrect it all? Oh, look, good. Phew, we're still doing
because
that thing.
that
That's good.
assessor is going to look at that evidence and he is going to make sure that you've done the proper reporting throughout it. So
That's right.
you can show him that you've kept up your framework.
Yeah, no, very good. Okay, so what is this thing, CMMC? High level. Paula, you want to talk about this? Just kind of, I'm sure everybody can use the AI and know generally what it is, but you want to kind of talk
Yeah,
through this high
in a
level?
nutshell, um, CMMC is based on NIST 800-171 standards.
Yep.
And the 171 standards are pretty standard clause in most DoD contracts. And then it's all meant to protect CUI, which is controlled unclassified information, and to an extent FCI, which is federal contract information. But the difference is that the CMMC is actually the certification process. It's the stamp that you actually comply with the NIST 171 standards. And there's 3 levels. Level 1, nobody's really going to be hanging out there anymore, but that aligns with one of the government clauses is usually always in contract. It's which is FAR 52-201-21. And we can talk letters and numbers forever, but I'm going to try not to here. We call it the basic 15. And those are the basic 15 security requirements you have to pass. The next level is level 2, and that's where most companies are finding themselves at. And that's the 110 controls, which have an associated 320 objectives you have to meet. Level three, most companies aren't going to see that. And if they do need to be a level three, chances are the government has told them they need to be already. There's only about 600 of those. That's mostly like your L3 Harris, Boeing, Raytheon kind of companies.
Yeah, no, that's really good. You brought up a couple of things. So level one is self-assessment. You wouldn't
Mhm.
necessarily, you wouldn't engage you wouldn't need to engage a C3PAO for level one. You
No,
could
you
if you
don't.
chose to, or you could engage a third party to do that. But that's kind of basic. So really,
Mhm.
anybody should be thinking through that level one. So, but here's another question for you, because I know we just came across this, is some companies are thinking, okay, I'm going to do level two and then I'm going to be an overachiever and go ahead and go for level three, because that would be the right thing to do. But but what you just said is level three is really prescripted from the government. It's really going to be a smaller group of companies forever. And so most companies, level two is going to be just what they
Right.
need. Would a company,
Yeah.
would you suggest they try to be an overachiever to level three?
It's got to be very strategic to do that. It will open up some contracts for you, but just having the level three isn't going to get you the contracts. You also have to market for the contracts and all that as well. And it's a really big step in maturity, huge step in maturity between two and three. So, from the financial, from the business, from all those aspects, you really have to consider a lot of things before you decide to go for that.
Yeah, thank you for that. And you mentioned 171. So isn't
Mhm.
CMMC just 171? We hear that a lot too in dealing with companies. Like it's just the same thing, right? Yes, but no. I mean,
No.
171 is definitely the undergirding
Yeah.
requirements, but CMMC is a different ballgame.
Yeah. I recently actually had the privilege of seeing a company through the 171 with the government assessment and then the CMMC with a third party. And we got to demonstrate just how different that they were. So, with CMMC,
Yep.
it's a lot more um, in-depth look at your practices and your evidence, and you have to scope for it a little bit differently than with the 171, um, and really have good documentation of all your processes and practices.
Yeah, 171 has been around for a while, of course, and it has the Spurs score with it. And, we often see companies, I'm a perfect 110, woohoo. And so that's great. But then when you really start to kind of drill into the nit of the 320, that's where a lot of companies like, oh, whoopsie, because under the 110 is actually all of these sub requirements. And when you go to do your CMMC level two audit, they're going to dip down to the 320. And so that's what we're seeing with a lot of companies is they're looking at the 110 like, yeah, yeah, I do that. Yeah, yeah, I do that, I do that. But when you really start to get into the nit of the 320, ooh, it kind of unravels and fall apart because it's a lot. 320 sub-objectives. They're very detailed. Definitely a different ball game. But CMMC, the undergird of it is 171. That did not change. It's
Nope.
just now it's a third party, very detailed look. You mentioned scoping. That is monumentally important. We're seeing a lot of companies shortchange or not understand that as well. We're going to talk about that here in just a second. But let's talk about ROI. Like this is a huge thing. Yeah.
Yeah, and you aren't going to hear a lot of consultants say this, but I really feel strongly about this
Go for
part
it,
of it.
Paula. We're here to help people, so go for it.
Yeah, yeah. If you are a small company, a very small company, you have to recognize that this is a financial undertaking for your
Big time.
company.
Yep.
So I have a background in business, so I understand the financial workings of how this goes on, and just know that an audit alone, even if you're a small company, costs between 130 plus just
Yes.
for the audit. That's not getting ready for the audit. Um, so you add in
Correct.
the cost if you have to ask somebody to come in and help you, or you
Yep.
have to build up all the cybersecurity from your tech stack around it.
Yep.
What that costs versus what your revenue is from your government contracts. Uh,
Yep.
are you coming out in the positive as a result of that? Because if you aren't, you might want to examine finding other areas to gain revenue from versus the investment into CMMC if you can't see more money coming in as a result of having the certification.
Yeah, that's a really good point. You wouldn't just
Mhm.
kind of willy-nilly decide this. You mentioned we talked about ISO earlier. A lot of the government contracts are even starting to put ISO 27001 in there. So, that would be a good kind of first pursuit for a company that would start to validate the security program. But it is really just math. I mean, the reality is it's not just the cost of the audit, it's not just the cost of getting ready. It's the cost of running this program ongoing. Again, 320 requirements, don't take that lightly. You have to stay on top of those, make sure those stay where they are. The SSP, which is kind of your crown document, that's a living document. You got to keep it up to date. It's not something you dust off once a year. And then there's opportunity cost. The people that you put on this, what are they not on? Or are you going to go hire new people? Are you wearing people out? I mean, there's so much opportunity cost in there. So it really does just become math, which, if you've got huge amounts of revenue tied to to this, well, then obviously
Mhm.
that's a duh, go do
Yeah,
it.
it's a
But
no-brainer.
no brainer, yes. But if you
Yeah.
don't,
Yeah, but if your
uh,
contracts, yeah, if your contract's $150,000 a year in revenue,
great. Yeah,
I'd make some really hard choices there, you know.
yeah. Yeah, no, that's the whole point here. So timeline, let's talk about this briefly. So this is also a factor in this is time. So CMMC has been talked about for several years now, but wasn't really like fully legit. So companies kind of looked at it, they kind of didn't, and then now we're seeing it this past year. We have a lot of companies that we've worked with and are working with to help them on this journey. And so now it's becoming legit and it's just like growing every day because now it's happening. So
Right.
there's definitely a supply and demand problem right now. Now that will correct over time, but it's probably a few years out before that corrects. So now you have this influx of demand. I got to have CMMC. I got to have it tomorrow. I got to have it. I got to have it. And then, but now you have very limited C3PAOs who can do the audit supply. That's part of why the cost is what it is. And then just the cycles to get on their schedule and to get really ready for your audit. But talk about even like the remediation timeline. Like what does that look like for a company?
Um, so it really depends on where you start your journey at. If you're starting from nothing, it's going to take a year to 18 months just to get ready, just from a technical remediation perspective. If you've got your tech in place, the timeline definitely shortens depending on how many resources you can devote to it. So, 6 months to a year, that's a pretty fair time frame to do the remediation if you need the processes and the policies, procedures put into place. But then at the end of it, supply and demand we were just talking about, you've got to find an assessor to come and do your assessment. And
Yep.
I think there's only 60 something actually authorized to do these assessments. There's a lot more that have the certification, but they've got to go through an authorization process to actually do the assessment. And there's not that many of them right now. So, think 80,000 in the DIB and 60 some odd guys to do the assessments. You can see how it might take a while to get on their calendar.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's a factor. And then there's of the 320 requirements, obviously there's the technical things and putting technical controls in place definitely can take time. A lot of times there's the money that needs to be spent and budgeting that needs to be gotten. So there's that. But what we see a lot of, because we deal obviously with a lot of CISOs and a lot of very high end security folks, and so they're pretty good. I mean, they're running solid programs. CMMC is not their first framework, so they've already aligned to
Mhm.
others, and so the technology is not as far away as you might think in those particular cases. But then what we see is scoping becomes big challenges. And then, oh my
Mhm.
gosh, the documentation requirements. CMMC is just very documentation heavy. Some frameworks are, some frameworks aren't. They kind of just slide on the scales of really kind of the emphasis on the documentation. But CMMC is one of
Right.
those that is very documentation heavy. So do
Yes.
not like underestimate that. So if
That
it's
writing
so,
down
oh,
every, oh, go ahead.
go ahead. No, you go ahead,
I said
Paula.
writing down everything about your system does take some time.
Oh, we see them. Those
Yeah.
SSP documents are, hundreds of pages. I mean, they're if they're
Yes.
done well, they're very long,
If
and
they're
they're
done
all
correctly, yes.
if they're done correctly. That's a very key point. Ding, ding, ding. So if the ROI makes sense, it's in the government contracts, like, yep, this, well, yay, us, we're this CMMC level 2 thing. We definitely need to, or 3, we definitely need to embark in this. Here's what would that even look like? I mean, at a minimum, scoping is huge. That should
Mhm.
happen very early in the process. Then you should do a gap analysis, like what do we do today? How does that align to the 320? Figure out where your holes are, and then really look to obviously close those holes, documentation, the SSP, all the way down to your policies and procedures, really ticking and tying and bringing all that together, doing that remediation, and then getting your team ready to do that audit. Paula, would you add anything to that kind of high level? This would be the steps of what you would do.
Yeah, and not to gloss over it, but as you're doing this documentation, really make sure that you're actually implementing what you're writing down and not just writing it down.
No,
Because I've
no.
seen that happen
Silly
too, and
talk,
it'll
silly
it'll bite
talk.
you in the butt on the at the end. So don't do that. That's part of what takes time, is not just writing it down, is that it's the actual doing of it that takes time
Yeah.
to in that the mediation process. And then when you get to the end, make sure that you're, Lisa, have training your team down here. Super important. They
Yep.
have to know all the processes too. They have to know how to do them. They have to know the secure, have all the security training. So that's part of it. And then preparing for the assessment is a huge deal too. Gathering the evidence, organizing the evidence, even, and then making sure that your people say the right things when they are in the interview with the third party assessor. Because if that doesn't go correctly, you'll fail controls, and
Yeah.
I've seen it happen.
We've seen it.
So,
We've seen it very
yeah,
recently. Yes.
yeah,
It happens. Yeah, I want to go back to what you said about the documentation. I don't want to gloss over that because it's so
yeah.
powerful. D- Write it down, tick and tie it to all of the 320, and make sure you actually do it. And that last step seems so obvious. Well, duh, Paula, why would anybody write down something that they don't actually do? Here's how it happens. It all We see it. I'm sad to say we've seen it a lot, and it typically starts with some sort of pursuit of the easy button. Oh, I've downloaded this package of whatever, this is what it says I need to do, but not really the rigor and the due diligence of going through of what actually is done. Or you buy the easy button tool, push the button, but nobody went through the diligence of, okay, wait a minute, we need to like really dive into this. And like when we do assessments, we trust but verify. Like it's not good enough to just say you do this thing.
No,
I need to
you
see
gotta
it with
show
my
me.
eyes. I got to
Yeah.
see what you're talking about to validate that what this says is really what you do, because that's what the assessor's going to do. And so that's really super important. And I just didn't want to minimize that because we chuckle about that. But Paula, we see it all the time. And not just CMMC, we see it with ISO, we see it with SOC 2,
Yeah,
we see it with all of them. Well,
yeah.
this is what it says I needed to do, but you don't do that. Or you do some very small version of that. I know we're doing a lot more DORA work right now, and it's very nitpicky as well. And so
Well,
again, the same thing. You can write it down all day long, but do you do the 10 different subparts that this thing says you need to do? And that's really critically important to engage in all of the 320 requirements to that level of detail. And
it's
so
it's
on that, oh, go
almost
ahead. Oh, go ahead.
it's almost, you really have to change the cybersecurity mentality and culture of your company in order to do good at this. Everybody's got to be on board, and you all
Yeah.
have to be working towards cybersecurity maturity. in order to really catch on to this. And it's not just CMMC, all the frameworks.
All of
You
them,
can't
yes.
look at them as checking the boxes and filling out some paperwork to make it look like you've done stuff. Else you're defeating yourself.
Yeah, and we talked about this a little bit at the beginning, but great point. Thank you so much for bringing that out. If you're building and running a security program with every intent to protect your company, your data, people, then this is just a layer on top of that. And yes, you have to make sure that you meet the specifics of this framework, that framework, this framework, including CMMC, which definitely has some very high-end specifics. But the reality is, it's exactly what you said. I feel like sometimes companies are backwards, like, oh, let me get through this compliance thing and I'll do security later, or I'll do it separate. Can I tell you they're not separate? The intent of compliance is to be secure. If you miss that, you miss the whole point. Exactly what you just said. And so CMMC is no different. These 110 controls and 320 requirements are determined by a body of people that say, this is what needs to be in place to protect our data, the government's data. So it is absolutely about security and protection. The problem is when companies try to blast through those stuff, check, check, check as quickly as they can, because I just need to get to the end in my certification. And then this is where it gets the bad rap of, oh, that certification doesn't really mean anything. And that's really unfortunate. So we'll move on past that. The other thing I wanted to
Yeah.
say here is, someone like yourself, who's certified in CMMC. I mean, we work with a lot of companies to help them get prepared. Shameless plug, but don't really seriously don't try to go this thing alone. We see companies that have tried to do this thing alone, and then they engage us to come in and actually help them do it properly, and then actually get their certification and start to move down that journey in an appropriate way. And can I tell you that lost time and that lost money is, that's expensive. That's very expensive.
Yeah.
So, what are some common things that we're seeing? I think we've talked about some of these. I know the SSP and the lack of ticking time to the 320 requirements. We see that hands down most times, that we engage with companies, at least kind of new
Yeah.
into this. What else do you see?
I mean, there's poor SSPs, there's policies and procedures that aren't quite up to snuff, or they're implementing, but not really implementing
Yep.
to the standard. Um, there's a lot of controls that, smaller businesses don't really think of because it's not their first thought when they get up in the morning. I need to have a change management and a risk assessment program. No, I get that. I know why it's not there because it's not critical to their business at that point in time.
Yep.
But just that's to say, there's different scales of everything. You don't have to have a big, huge, fancy program in order to meet the requirement. You
Yep.
just have to have a program that works for your business within the scale of your business. So it's not really surprising where we usually see the gaps, especially when we're working with smaller companies.
Yeah, and we work with some sizable ones as well, and we see
Yeah,
similar
and we
gaps,
still
quite
see some of
frankly.
those same things.
It's not necessarily that different, but yes, we see a lot of the same gaps, which is funny. The bigger companies definitely are more on top of their technical controls for sure,
Yes.
because there is much more kind of a commitment and a thought to security. So we do see that different. But I'll just one of those on there is asset management, and it's so funny because that's like security 101, know your assets, because how do you protect them? So
Yeah.
in CMMC, this is part of the prescriptiveness is what is your scoping? What are all of your assets that are in scope for that scoping? Like it's so basic and rudimentary. Every company should be doing that. But again, how often do we see that companies have a hard time even nailing asset management? I hear this all the time. Oh, well, this thing over here discovers all of our assets. Can I tell you that's not asset management? What about the things you purchase? What about the things sitting on the shelf for repair? What about the things ready for decommission? I mean, do you know where your stuff is? Come on, there's so much more to it than just that. But
Yeah. I
we
think know
see
the whole life cycle. Yeah.
yeah, the whole life
Yeah.
cycle. But we see that all the time across all of the processes, is the end-to-end life cycle of the process, all the pieces, parts. This is one of my personal favorites too, is decommission of vendors. How many times do we see in a vendor management or third-party risk management program that there's actual call out for how they decommission vendors, how they make sure they get their data back, how they make sure they cut off any data feeds? Can I tell you, a lot of times I see that part of the process lacking. And so it's that full life cycle end to end for these processes. And, we see that in here. CMMC is just more prescriptive about it. And then that last bullet, continuous monitoring. Again, these are not set it and forget it. These are security programs, is the intent of all of this to be run. So what are, no, not saying checking the boxes. It's not what we're doing here. But let's try to split some hairs to give some context. Yes.
Yeah. So if you're looking like at a if you're small and you can't do a gold standard, there's things that are nice to have, but there's things that you have to have in your company in order to have any hope of meeting the assessment. We've mentioned scoping the SSP many times. POAMs, you're not going to be able to have POAMs when you go into assessment, but along the process of remediating, you have to have POAMs in place, and you're going to have to show the assessor that you were keeping track of the things that you knew you didn't meet along the way. Again, you have to have policies and procedures for all 14 domains. Your security training program really needs to be in place for a lot of reasons, but you're not going to pass it without having, at least a yearly gathering and education on cybersecurity. Incident response plans. These don't have to be big and fancy, but you got to know what you're going to do when something goes sideways, period. Because if you don't have a plan for it, so what's the saying? If you fail to plan, you plan to fail. And that's kind of the reasoning.
Love it.
You got to have that. And there's even some specific language in the CMMC about incident response reporting you have to be prepared for as well. Again, FIPS is probably one of the hardest things for most companies to meet. And that's a validated encryption module. It can't be compliant. It's got to be a module that is validated by an outside lab. You don't have to go do it. You just have to buy the appliance that has it in there already. And the configuration management is probably another one of the biggest ones that companies have problems with, because most of them don't write it down. And it can just be a simple checklist. When I get a laptop, this is what I do to it. When I get a server, this is what I do to it. Or I get a piece of software, this is what I do to it. Just have to have those checklists all in one place and be able to show them. But it's not done, and that's the problem. So, and if you wanted to go mature your program and be even more secure, there's automations to just about all of this these days. Having a SOC center. Yeah, and from a technical standpoint, you can automate monitoring, you can automate auditing, you can automate, oh my gosh, so much of this. Data loss protection, that's another really nice to have in here. And you can build playbooks for your incident response plan. So instead of just saying, when something goes sideways, this is what we're going to do, you can have playbooks set up for each kind of incident that happens. And this is what happens when we have a malware. This is what happens when, oh my gosh, something else crazy happens. I've got a plan for it. Don't even have to think. Pen testing, that's not required, but it is a good practice to have. You do have to do vulnerability scans, but you don't have to do pen testing. Risk management, we're going to say risk management with all the fancy bells and whistles, because you can do risk management at a very small level, and it does require that you do that. But there's very much different levels of risk management that you can implement in your company.
Absolutely. Yeah, and it's interesting in seeing this. I mean, this is not well, the FIPS thing is new, obviously, but this is not new stuff. Like when you build and run compliance programs, a lot of this stuff is the same. The other thing I like what you're saying, Paula, is wherever you base, I mean, all this is a journey. You can't go
Mhm.
from nothing to level 5 maturity or whatever scale you want to use overnight. It doesn't make sense. Nobody has money and time to even do that. And
No.
so you baseline where you start. And so I like the
Mhm.
way that this is because, these must-haves, like you have to have this stuff. You should do them with integrity. So it's not about checking boxes. However, there are different levels of maturity legitimately in how these things can be done. You just gave a great example. I can have a basic IRP that hopefully we've tested in at least a tabletop, or I can go all the way down the scale to have actual playbooks and do much more extensive testing, and so people truly understand their role, and you have all that, and there's all these layers in the middle as well. And so and so this is all a journey, and it's all based on time and budget and resources and aligning back to the objectives of the company. And so definitely what you want to do is baseline with, okay, here's what I have to get, but then you don't ever stop there. Like this world of
Mhm.
cybersecurity has changed while we've been on this session, quite frankly. And so none of this stuff ever is stopped. So you baseline, you be successful, but then what is your next year plan? What is your plan after that? Like, how are you going to bring this up? You mentioned DLP. A lot of companies, still haven't really nailed the DLP solutions, which a lot of the frameworks it's not explicitly required. It's a great idea, but where is it on your roadmap? Like when is it going to come into the scene? Or if you already have it, are you continually tuning it? Are you continually expanding it across the organization? You mentioned compliance monitoring. That would be different than like, ISO or SOC 2 or something like that. This would be like, are things technically in compliance across your network? Like baseline, you mentioned configuration management in the baselines. It's great. Companies maybe can muddle through having a document written down. But then you ask them the next question. When was the last time you went out into your environment and made sure everything matched this? What? Wait, what's that
Yep.
question? Yeah, again, that's what you should be doing. But those are layers of
Yes.
maturity that can grow. Again, the must have is a great place to start and to baseline, but then aligned with your business objectives, aligns with budget and time and resources. But then what is your plan for progressing this thing year over year over year? And then it's
Mhm.
interesting because a lot of this stuff is the same. The actual things are the same in other frameworks. And so this is not mutually exclusive. You don't just go do CMMC in a bubble. If you do that, oh my gosh, you've just built an inefficient beast that you have to try to maintain. And so the name of the game is to build a compliance program. Oh, I'm sorry, I totally skipped. I skipped a slide. Audit. Sorry, my bad. That's the next slide. Paula, what should you expect in the actual audit when it happens? We touched on some of this.
So there's a whole process. There's
Yep.
a document you can find out on the internet. It's called the CMMC CAP. It's a certification assessment process, not whatever, the rest of the
Yeah,
industry calls CAP.
I know.
Um, and basically, you're going to go out and you're going to find yourself a C3PAO. And there's a question here in the comments about what do you need to look for when you're selecting a C3PAO? And
Great
honestly,
question.
you got to make sure that they align to how you're doing things and that they kind of have the same views on cybersecurity that you do. There's some that are very, very strict. There's some that are very, very lax. And you don't want the lax guy, and the reason is because your assessment probably won't be respected in the end. But you need to have somebody that kind of has the same views as you do on cyber. Um, Ask good questions to them about how they do assessments. But you'll engage with the guy. You'll with the C3PO. The next part is you'll do a pre-assessment, and they'll go through your documentation, like your CUI data flow, your assets lists, and your SSP, and they'll look at those things. Any contractor uh, what's the word, the responsibility matrices, and they'll look at those and say, okay, you're ready to go to assessment or not. And at that point, if they tell you you're not, you got to go and you got to do some more work. If not, if they say you're good to go, they'll put you on their schedule. And then during the audit, they're going to look at all 320 of your objectives, all the evidence for 320
Line
objectives. They're going
by
to look
line.
line by line. They're going to look at the evidence that you have that shows that you proves that you do it, and they're going to conduct interviews with your staff to ensure that these things are actually happening.
Yeah, don't minimize the line by line. It will be to the 320. You mentioned picking your C3PAO. We actually have a session on April 1st called the Audit Trap, where we're going to talk about auditors and does it matter one auditor versus another. And this would absolutely apply to CMMC. But thank you for picking up that question, Paula. But yes, it does matter. You do want a C3PA, you want an auditor in general that's going to align to your level of security integrity, to be quite honest. And so that way you know that they're actually validating what you do. One thing that we haven't really talked about too much, and I know internally we talk about it all the time, is scoping. So scoping is huge. And so, like in the PCI world, you want to scope to your cardholder data environment and very specific to PCI, because PCI is so rigorous, not to this level, but so rigorous that you don't want to say, oh, it's just everything. Like, have good
No,
security practice
no,
across everything, but it's not
right,
everything. So
right.
in CMMC, scoping is like huge. So can you talk
Yeah.
about that? Because I know we're seeing companies like, no, no, it'd just be everything. Oh, no, you don't want everything. Trust me.
You wanna define your CUI environment to like the tiniest sliver
Tiniest.
possible. If it's 1 to 2 people that actually get the CUI, that's fine. That's all you want to have to deal with, because every device, every person, every facility that handles a CUI becomes in scope. And when it becomes in scope, it has to meet all 320 objectives, every piece of the CMMC assessment. So you want to make that as small as possible. And you start by identifying who actually uses this, who handles the CUI, what systems actually handle the CUI, and how can you make that smaller, quite
Yeah.
frankly.
Yeah, it's really true. That is the name of the game. Now, that's not to say you don't take the 320 or some of them and roll them out intentionally across your organization. Like good practice is good practice, full
Good
life cycle
practice.
process
Yeah.
is what it is, and you should do that. So it's not that you would say, "Oh, these two people that are in scope, y'all make sure you do your security awareness training." Meanwhile, we let other people across the organization just get away with not doing it. You would never do that. That would be poor security practice. But the point is, when the auditor for CMMC shows up, you want them to focus on the two people. You don't want them to focus on all these other
Yeah.
people over here.
Like
So it,
you get to,
yeah,
yeah, you get to say what your scope is. You get to say what to tell the assessor what he's going to examine. So make
yep.
sure it's not everything.
Yeah. And I like that they've done that. You know, SOC 2 has something similar. It's not intended to be your whole organization. ISO, on the flip side, is intended to be more so. It does have a scoping mechanism, but it's intended to more so be your security program. CMMC has very much left room for you get to define, management gets to define, this is the bubble that this thing applies to. SOC 2 is very similar. This is the bubble that this audit applies to. And so don't miss that step. And we're going to move on in the interest of time. But Paula, out of the scoping, what are some of the evidences that the assessor is going to expect to see that says, okay, you look like you actually went through the scoping exercise?
Yeah, so there's actually a scoping document that CMMC has. You can
Perfect.
find on the internet anywhere. You can
Thank you.
start there. I
Yep.
highly recommend it. And you start by gathering your asset lists, and that's hardware, software, people, facilities, locations. You get it all together, and then you're going to need to categorize everything into CUI assets, security protection assets, contractor risk managed assets, specialized assets, and out of scope. So by the categories that are provided to you, you have to take each one of those assets and assign it to them. And then when you get down to having everything assigned, you have to include the CUI, the SPAs, CMRAs. Those all go into your CUI data flow diagrams that you'll be asked to produce during assessment.
Yeah,
And
no
that
work
really scopes,
diagrams. Yep.
yeah, and that scopes your CUI environment right there.
Yep. And data flow diagrams, just be honest, those are very difficult for companies across the board. We see them sometimes they're to the nth degree, and that's really not the intent here, but it is to be able to articulate that yes, I know where my data lives, I know where it flows through the assets
And
internally, but
how it's
also
separated.
yeah, and
And
also
how it's separated.
externally and how it's separated. Yes. And so this is definitely the mechanism that shows that. I feel like a lot of what we do is art, and there's definitely an art to kind of how you do that right level of diagram that we
Right.
help companies with. And then the shared responsibility matrices is huge as well. You want to talk briefly why that's so important?
Sure. So especially if you're hiring an MSP
Mhm.
to come in and help out your companies, and a lot of small businesses do that, and it's a great idea. But you got to know what they're doing and what you're doing, and who has responsibility for it. So they have these shared responsibility matrices uh, that you need to provide during the assessment to show that you understand who does what.
Yeah, and it goes up the chain the other way because we help companies with this as well. So if you have companies that are
Mhm.
CMMC level two and you're part of their ecosystem, then you have to provide what they need up the other way as well, even if you
Right.
yourself are not CMMC
Yep.
certified per se. And that's where this comes into play as well. So it's not just downstream,
Correct.
but it's also upstream as well.
Correct. Yes.
Very good. Okay. So I was trying to jump the gun. So here is you do your audit. Thank you for that, Paula. You're successful. You've got your certification. It's a 3-year cycle. You're monitoring your program. What is next? So a lot of companies, CMMC is not their first certification or attestation. They have others, and so this layers on top of it. So here's the reality. If you do CMMC in a silo or bubble, it's highly inefficient, very difficult to sustain unless your company has lots of money to just go hire CMMC specific resources, which most don't. That's the situation that you kind of put yourself in. The better way is to build a program. You probably already have some semblance of that with your other security frameworks and regulatory. CMMC should fold into that. So it is a single security program that, yes, satisfies compliance X, Y, and Z, CMMC being one of those. You definitely want that system of record. These are great candidate for GRC tools, but GRC tools that are end-to-end system of records, the full life cycle of governance, risk, and compliance, not just trying to be the easy button. If you can automate some of that, that's great. There's definitely automation capabilities. And so when companies get to that point, yeah, you should definitely take advantage of that as well. And then these are programs to be run. It's just like accounting. You don't just do your books one time. Nope, you do it every month. Nope, you monitor your financial position daily. This is no different than that. So you're monitoring this continuously, not just from a technical standpoint, but also from a process standpoint, just like we were talking about. Are people really doing their security awareness training? Are assets really configured in compliance? This is the monitoring aspect. And then when things fail, and they will, this is where you put it on the POAM. This is where you keep that up. Again, this is a living cycle. And then as things change, which they will, this is where you make sure your policies and procedures are kept up to date. You make sure that your SSP is up to date, and it just becomes this continuous cycle of running this all as one cohesive security compliance program. Paula, anything to add to that?
I think that you covered that all well.
Thank you. Uh, so there's a lot of resources out there. You mentioned several of them. Here's some more.
Mhm.
But what I would say to everybody listening is connect with us on LinkedIn. We will answer your questions. You can connect with us. We'll send you our email. We're happy to answer your questions. We're happy to give you additional resources. So don't hesitate to reach out. This is kind of a journey that everybody's been thrust into, and in a lot of ways, it changes daily. Sometimes it feels like they like to rename things. They like to put things on pause and then push things through again and change the language of stuff. And so, we're here, we're all kind of on this journey together. So don't hesitate to reach out to us on LinkedIn. Anything you want to highlight in particular there, Paula, on
Um,
the resources?
yeah, so the DoD CIO has a lot of good stuff on their site. They've got FAQs, they've got a lot of information that answers crazy questions as you may have about like the very specific environment that you have. There's so many things answered there. I
Yeah.
definitely would look in there for really out of the off the wall kind of questions you may have about your environment.
Yeah, and you're reminding me of something we see too. Of the 320 requirements, quite frankly, some of it's just wonky. You just sit there and stare at it like, I'm sorry, where are you going with this? And so we see this all the time with companies that try to do this on their own, that they'll just make their best guess as to what they think
Yeah,
that thing means. And we see whole sections of SSPs where we're like, This is not even what this
didn't
is."
really
Totally missed
answer
the
the
mark.
question. Yeah.
Correct. So again, use these resources. Again,
Mhm.
another case to really leverage some deep expertise in this space to make sure that you nail it the first time in getting
Yeah.
this right. But yeah, there's a lot of resources out there. Okay, several key takeaways here. But Paula, if there's like one thing you want to make sure and leave the audience with from your perspective, what would that be?
Oh, I nail it into your head time and time again, Sherry,
Probably.
is
I'm waiting for it. Wait for it.
yeah, make sure your scoping is done well
Yep.
and that this
Oh,
is something that is worth it for your company. Really, that's two things, but
that's
scope and
okay.
make sure that the ROI is there.
Yeah, no, those are really important. Don't underestimate the effort. And yes, we just see the scoping missed so much, so many times. Companies like, "Oh yeah, yeah, I did that," but no. And then the whole limited scoping thing, like that's a big thing. The name of the game is to really minimize the scoping. It's not just to do it like, "Oh yeah, here's everything." No, no. How can you like really minimize it? That really is key to success. It's very similar, PCI. It's the same thing. You want as little in there as you can possibly do. And then there are some third parties that you can leverage, which is great because that can kind of offload some of those requirements onto those third parties. But again, you're still ultimately responsible for your certification if you use that. And that's where those shared matrices come into place.
And truly, we could have a whole nother webinar on third
We
parties.
could.
That's an issue within in CMMC. We did not, we understand it, but we kind of glossed over it today, just FYI.
Well, there you go. That can be a future topic. Love it.
Yeah.
And then from my perspective is I would just remind everybody there's no easy button for this. I'm a tech nerd. I grew up in my career in the ranks of IT, and so I love technology, and I think it's amazing what technology can do, and we definitely want to leverage the resources around it, but we see so many companies go sideways in this mass pursuit of trying to check the box as easy and as quickly as they can, and that is just not security. And so I would just kind of remind everyone back to what you said, Paula, the ROI has to be there because this is a thing to run and stay on top of. It needs to be melded in with your larger compliance program so that you can run and stay on top of this and actually achieve the result of good security and protection for our company and our people. So really awesome. Thank you so much, Paula. So what questions do we have that we definitely have a few minutes to embark in some of these questions?
So there's a question of the question says that if all government program work is conducted in the CMMC provision cloud,
I
then the
see that.
team only needs to achieve level one. So what that really means is maybe they've been on board with a prime contractor who's opened up an enclave and they've got these virtual desktops that they're beaming out to all their subcontractors. Um, they don't just need level one. They need whatever is in their actual contract with the prime contractor. And 99 times out of 100, I'd say, they are flowing down the requirement from the government to their subcontractors that they have to be level 2 or they have to be whatever. So if it says you only have to be level 1 in your contract, that's what you have to be. But I'm pretty sure it's going to say level 2 at this point because they aren't doing a lot of the level 1 stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, you bring
So
you
that's a check your contract thing. It has nothing to do with your VDI.
Yeah, no, that's a great reminder. This is a contractual requirement, bottom line, pure and simple. This
Mhm.
is a contractual requirement. That's what it is. And if it's not in your contract, theoretically, then you don't need to worry about it. However, as you
Mhm.
just said, 99 out of 100 times, expect it's going to start showing up in the contracts, like hard stop. And so companies who have that revenue tied to this, they really need to consider that.
Yeah.
And you brought up another thing. It rolls downhill. I say that with,
Mhm.
we're doing a lot of door work and that rolls downhill as well. And so a lot of this stuff, there's this kind of top layer of where it starts. So this would be the government. And then there's those that maybe have those direct contracts, but then there's those that have those contracts here. And so it's just going to keep going down. Now it will disseminate at some point, but the point
Yeah.
is it does roll down. So even if you don't have direct government contracts, it doesn't mean you can ignore this thing. But again, just what you said, Paula, this is a contractual requirement. We can't forget that. Let's see. Are there common mistakes organizations make when preparing their evidence? I so what we see a lot is one, they don't go through the full body of the 320 requirements for the evidence. So that's a mistake. The other thing is they don't tick and tie. They don't know for each of the 320 what actually would I look at? What is the tick and tie of the policy? What is the tick and tie of the procedure? And what would actually evidence this thing? And so they don't go through that because that's a massive amount of work. And
Yeah.
then on top of that, I would go back to we're also seeing a lot of companies misinterpreting what the requirement actually means. And so they're reading it kind of high level, like, oh yeah, yeah, okay, yeah, we do. We do change management. Yeah, we do that. And then they just move on. And again, it's that really specificity of going line by line and all the ticking and tying. Paula, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I would also add that they're looking, I mean, this is literally what the process says is they're looking for adequacy and they're looking for sufficiency. So they're looking for you to prove that you can do it, whether that's a policy or a screenshot or a live test of whatever your system is. And they're looking for sufficiency, which means it's not just this deep, it's this deep in your company that practice is being implemented.
Yeah. No, that's really good. Thank you for that. You want to take that, what's some advice on scoping question?
Uh, so CTI is actually a subset of CUI. It's a type of CUI. So when you're doing your scoping and you're writing your SSP, there's actually a section that says what kind of CUI do you handle, and there's a NARA, which is where all the CUI records are kept and of what the types of CUI are kept, has lists of the types of CUI. And actually, we can come up with a link and add it to this later. And CTI is a type of that. So I wouldn't separate them in your mind. CTI is CUI. But as far as scoping to the organization is you really have to know where your CUI flows through. Like where is it stored? Who's sending it? When you're sending it, what switches, firewalls, um, out to your boundaries is it encountering along the way? And those are the things that are in scope. And if you can isolate those into VLANs or zones, it's better for your company in order to being able to scope that down. So no, everything shouldn't be in scope, just the things that handle CUI or provide security to the CUI process, handling process.
Awesome. And again, feel free to connect with us on LinkedIn and ask further questions. We're certainly happy to answer that. Um, what are the keys to finding a good assessor auditor? I think we kind of talked about that a little bit. And then what would you say, Paula, to companies that are really fighting that everything feels like it's in scope? I know you just touched on that a little bit, but how would you recommend like fighting that fight? Because we do see that a lot, quite frankly.
Yeah, again, it is just all where the CUI is. Like really, CMMC is about CUI. So you only need it where the CUI is. You know, if your human resources department probably doesn't have that much, so you don't need to include them. Don't include any your marketing team. They shouldn't have any CUI. You know, don't include them in the scope. Only include what's absolutely necessary to handle, process, transmit, store CUI and the assets that provide security for that.
Awesome.
And just make it as tiny as possible.
Well, awesome. Thank you so much, Paula. Very much appreciate you take the time. Thank you so much,
My
everyone in the
pleasure.
audience. Thank you for all the excellent questions. We really appreciate it. Hope everyone enjoyed and has their head stuffed full with a lot more information about CMMC. Thanks, everyone, for your time. Have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.